London Prospect, welcome to RTB 2021 for June the 6th, 2021. Hope you're doing well this day. So let's jump right into our text. We got some interesting ones today. Once again, of course, it's all going to be interesting in the book of Revelation, isn't it? We're getting into the heart of that with Revelation chapter 8 today. Then we have Isaiah 38, Deuteronomy 10, and Psalm 94. So let's jump right on in we'll start with Deuteronomy 10. So remember that in Deuteronomy, Moses has been rehashing some of the history of Israel. And again, this is all exhortative material. He's not just giving them a history lesson, is he? He is doing this to remind them of what they have done so they won't do it in the future. Particularly recalling the golden calf episode of Exodus 32 through 34. And then at the end of this chapter, he goes through and gives some exhortations based on that historical material. In other words, here's the indicative, here's what we know, what we experience, here's the imperative, here's what we should do. And so what should we do? What does the Lord require from you, O Israel? Verse 12, but to fear the Lord, to walk in his ways, to love him, to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. That's a pretty good summary of what even today, a believer's life should look like. Fearing the Lord, understanding who he is, understanding who we are in relationship to him, and living out our life with that knowledge, walking in his ways. Walking, of course, is just referring to your way of life, right? And then loving him with all your heart. This is again referring to our covenant relationship with him, serving the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, and to keep his commandments and the statutes which I'm commanding you today. Behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the highest heavens, the earth and all that is in it. Yet, speaking of his authority, yet on your fathers did the Lord set his affection to love them, chose their descendants after them, even above all the peoples, as it is this day. So God set his love on them, chose them out of all the peoples for no real righteousness of their own. But their response should be this: to circumcise their heart and stiffen their neck no longer. Beautiful picture here of this idea of circumcision of the heart. Really, the first time this is kind of introduced in our text, and yet it becomes a significant theme throughout the rest of the prophetic narratives as well, and then going into the New Testament. Circumcision, of course, was the outward sign that you were part of the people of God, the males in the people of Israel. This was the sign that you are part of the people of God. So it's a physical symbol of your membership in the people of God. But what God desires is a circumcised heart, a heart that the defining characteristic of the people of God shouldn't be what you are outwardly, but what you are inwardly. And of course, this is the challenge for the Israelites, right? Because and for all humanity, because we are inwardly far from God, and it requires something of a heart change. And that's what Ezekiel prophesies of, for instance, in Ezekiel 36, a heart change, a new heart that is given to us. Deuteronomy or Jeremiah chapter 4 talks about the same thing, a heart that is broken before the Lord, that comes from the grace of God himself. The other thing that you notice in this text is God's concern for the orphan and the widow and the alien, verse 18. This becomes a characteristic and should be a characteristic of God's people, as we've talked about before. God's people should mirror that characteristic of God by caring for those who are less fortunate. That's a defining picture of who God's people should be, a spiritual barometer, if you will, of the health of God's people in the Old Testament and perhaps even in the New. Brings us to Isaiah chapter 38. Actually, let's move to, before we get to Isaiah 38, we'll go over to Psalm 94. Now, I refer to these as the Yahweh Malach Psalms. This is a little bit of an interlude before we take these back up. So we had 93, and then it's going to be 95 through 99 are the Malach Psalms, the Yahweh reigns Psalms. This is a psalm, though, that explores, it's kind of more of a communal lament, exploring and asking God to take vengeance on those who are the wicked and the proud. and to act on behalf of his people. It's a very common theme that we've seen throughout the Psalms. Another common theme that we see is the idea, the comparison of God with humanity, that the Lord knows the thoughts of man, that they are mere breath, that they're just there and gone and pass away. And then we also have this idea that a very common, there's a bird outside my window, a common theme that God will not abandon his people. He will not forsake his inheritance. God is going to be faithful to his people to the end. And that's verse 14. That's also a theme that we're going to see, obviously, in the book of Revelation. We'll get there in just a minute. But we also see it here in Isaiah, as God has just delivered his people, that great deliverance from the Assyrians. But how does Hezekiah respond? This is a significant passage, because Isaiah 38 and 39, remember, this is that kind of that narrative interlude between those two major sections of Isaiah. And many scholars would argue that this section is setting up ultimately the section of Isaiah that looks forward to, or at least speaks to, the future exile of God's people. And to a certain extent, these two chapters do exactly that. We have this very positive portrayal of Hezekiah. The deliverance is majestic and gracious and amazing, miraculous deliverance of God's people in Isaiah 36 and 37. And then what happens in 38 and 39? Well, we have kind of a couple of events that prepare us for not so much of a positive thing that it's going to happen. A prediction of that future exile of God's people. Well, how does that happen? Well, to a certain extent, I'll talk about this more when we get to the books of Kings, because it's much more obvious there. But Isaiah 38 forms a death story. Now, if you're unfamiliar with that term, it's actually what I did my PhD research on, was death stories in the Old Testament. That's how I got the unfortunate nickname Dr. Death for a little while. Hopefully I don't have that nickname anymore. But anyway, death stories in the Old Testament have a particular pattern to them. And I think we've talked about this a little bit before, where you have the prediction of the announcement of impending death. Then you have the attempt to set the house in order through a speech or something like that. Then you have the response, or then you have the death itself, and then the response to the death, like burial, mourning, and those types of things. Most often it is that putting the house in order stage of the story that gets the most press, that gets the most ink, that's expounded upon the most by the author. And so what you expect is a normal progression in any death story, and there's about 10 major ones in the Old Testament. Normal progression is announcement of impending death, put your house in order, you die, and then people respond by mourning. That's the way it normally goes. But here we have a death story that operates differently, that kind of shocks the reader, because we have in verse 1 of 38, Isaiah coming. Well, first of all, the narrator says Hezekiah became mortally ill. In other words, mortally ill means you're going to die. So the narrator says that Isaiah is going to die. I'm sorry, that Hezekiah is going to die. Then Isaiah comes to Hezekiah and says, set your house in order, literally command your house, put your house in order, go to that next stage of this death story, because you're going to die and not live. Says it even two ways. He could have just said you're going to die, but he says you're going to die and not live. So the normal progression of the story should be Isaiah or Hezekiah should set his house in order, but he doesn't. He pleads one more time, probably what we would do as well, but that's not the author's point. The author's point is that what should have happened didn't happen. And that's exactly what is kind of the point of the rest of this narrative going into chapter 39, is that Hezekiah has this more time, but what should have happened doesn't happen. He doesn't set his house in order. And this disordered house ultimately sets the stage for the exile of Israel. And that will become much more clear when we get to chapter 39. But the other thing that happens, by the way, in that those extra 15 years that Hezekiah has, he has a son, and that son is named Manasseh, who just so happens to be the worst king that the Jewish people ever had. So he doesn't set his house in order, and this disordered house is setting the stage for the exile of Israel. If you want more details on that, you can read my chapter in my book on it, I guess. But anyway, we got a copy in the library. Go check it out. You don't buy it on the internet. It's way too expensive. But anyway, that's a fun story. And that brings us to, let's see, where are we at now? So we've done Deuteronomy 10, we've done Psalm 94, we've done Isaiah 38, and that brings us to Revelation, doesn't it? So we're getting back to Revelation. Remember that we're in these series of judgments, 7 judgments. So we had the seven seals. We're about to start the 7 trumpets, and then we're going to also get to the 7 bowls. And these are all judgments that are God's response to his persecuted people. Remember again, always come back to that original context of the book of Revelation, written to a persecuted people in that first century world, who really have no power of their own, do they? Because they're under the thumb of the Roman Empire. And are persecuted by the Jews, by the Romans, by the Greeks, by everybody in the first century world. So here we have this now, when Jesus is as the Lamb, as the seals are being broken, and we hadn't gotten to the 7th seal. We had 6 seals, and then we had the interlude in chapter 7, and now we get to the 7th seal. Finally, we get to the 7th seal. And what happens? Well, there's this silence in heaven. So remember what was going on in heaven. We had this continual praise of God from the elders and the creatures and all these different, the multitudes around the throne. But now we have silence for an hour and a half. And it's building up this anticipation. Silence, of course, builds anticipation. So this is, again, step back and allow this vision to hit you. Don't get lost in the details here, but allow the vision to hit you. So we have this anticipation building, not just in the people who perhaps were experiencing this vision like John, but also in the reader. So we're wondering what's going to happen. Well, the angel comes and takes to the altar holding a golden censer, and there's incense. So what is this incense? The incense represents, as it does in the Old Testament as well, the prayers of the saints ascending to the throne. Well, what are these people praying? Well, they're praying for vindication, and they're praying for justice on the part of God, even as we saw in previous chapters in Revelation here. And the angel takes the censer, filled it with the fire of the altar, and so it's almost as if the prayers come up and then they go down. So it's in response to those prayers that God acts, and he throws down, and it turns out to be these these judgments that are announced by these trumpets. And so now we're in the last of the 7 seals. It introduces to our 7 trumpets, judgments. And again, kind of building, as we talked about yesterday, kind of building up some anticipation, but also some intensity. The seal judgments resulted in 1/3 of the people being affected now, or 1/4 of the people. Now we're getting to 1/3 of the people here. But again, the overall point is, and the imagery that's used here, very much heavily steeped again in the Old Testament. Don't get caught up in trying to figure out, okay, where is this going to be an atomic bomb, or is this going to be this kind of thing fulfilled? And I don't think that's the point of the author. The point of the author is that in response to God's people praying for his justice, he's going to pour out his justice on the earth, and his woes on the earth. And the imagery, again, is all Old Testament imagery. Let me just give you an example. Verse 8, we have the second angel sounding the trumpet. And again, the trumpet would announce things in the Old Testament context, in the ancient Near Eastern context. Trumpets would be used to announce victory, announce proclamations from the king, and these types of things. The second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. And a third of the sea became blood, and the third of the creatures were in the midst of the sea, and all these different things. Again, it's just talking about in a very symbolic way, of the devastation of God's judgment. Um, Again, I don't think we need to be searching for these. Okay, well, is this going to be a volcano or a meteorite or things like that? Don't. This is Old Testament imagery, right? He's painting a picture for us, and the picture here comes from, of course, many of the images here, by the way, are going to come from the plagues in Egypt. God acting on behalf of his people to bring deliverance for them. That's the reason why he's using those plagues. But here he's in verse 8, this mountain is reminiscent of the imagery from Jeremiah 51, both 25 and 42, where God announces through Jeremiah that he's going to make Babylon this burnt mountain and cover it with the sea. And so he's using imagery of judgment from the Old Testament to describe this future judgment on the part of God vindicating his people. And again, that's the message of the book, right? God vindicating his people, God bringing forth justice, and doing it through ultimately through the reigning, ruling, resurrected Christ. So I don't know if that cleared up anything for you for Revelation, but we'll have some. We get through the 4 of the trumpets here in Revelation 8. We'll get to some other trumpets here coming up in future chapters. So anyway, hope you have a great rest of the day on this day, June the 6th, 2021.